what is the 18-year property cycle? Like, how do you explain this to someone that's brand new to the property investing world and kind of break it down?
Good question. Good place to start. Right. So we call it the 18-year property cycle. It's really, to my mind, the 18-year economic cycle. It's everyone knows that our economies go from boom to bust, and the rhythm of that boom and bust is driven by this 18-year cycle. We call it sometimes the 18-year property cycle because you see it most obviously in the property market. Because when you have a major crisis, the property market tanks. It's absolutely impossible to get a mortgage. It's there's a financial crisis. Banks are not lending. They're not lending for property. They're not lending for business. They're not lending anywhere. Some of them have to be bailed out. It's a really difficult time. So that's why it's sometimes referred to as the property cycle. But really, it is the fundamental driving factor for most of our economies, at least in sort of Western capitalist economies. It's 18 years in length on average, but it doesn't vary by all that much. It's typically 14 years up, 4 years of crisis and recovery. And the 14 years up are often, you can say, subdivided into a couple of 7-year halves with a minor mid-cycle recession in the middle.
Little baby recession, just to spice things up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it sometimes can be significant, but it's certainly not the same thing as the crisis at the end of the cycle.
I'm interested actually to hear about your thoughts on commercial property as well, Akhil. Maybe we'll dive into that at some stage, or actually, is it just the same? Is it exactly the same? It's just land. It doesn't really matter what's on that thing, right?
No, I mean, it is land, but commercial property. I mean, firstly, commercial property is a very disparate array of different uses of land. So you can talk like tall office buildings to logistics centers to medical facilities and so on. So I think it's a little difficult to, and particularly in this post-pandemic period, to put it all into one thing, not least because a lot of companies have offered remote working arrangements and so on and don't need their very sort of expensive central city buildings anymore. But as a general dynamic, what you tend to find is that the commercial property sector is much more sensitive to fluctuations in economic growth, because that drives a lot of business activity and so on. And so the first half of the cycle, commercial property does a lot worse than residential property. Traditionally, it's been the case that as you get towards the peak of the cycle, you really get a boom in certain aspects of commercial property. So, for example, in the 1920s into the peak the land price peak was in 1926 in the US, but, the stock market went on a couple of years extra. You had all this sort of crazy building in Manhattan, all these actually now what we regard as very sort of elegant Art Deco buildings, but, far more building than was needed for actual demand. I think you'll see something similar in parts of the world. I mean, in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, there's an enormous commercial property boom going on. In places where tourism has opened up and has gone gangbusters, you might see the same thing with kind of leisure facilities and so on, but maybe not so much in office space, because people are still trying to work out what the company of the future looks like. So there's sort of certain variations in commercial property because it's a much more diverse set of assets than residential property.
Can you explain what we've got here?
Yeah, so this was created to illustrate the broad dynamics of the cycle. So I mentioned that sort of 14 years up, 4 years down. And then the sort of 14 years up is 2 7-year halves with a mid-cycle slowdown in the middle. So it gives you a visualization that you start at, the bottom of the cycle, you go up for about 7 years, you then have a mid-cycle slowdown. That sets the scene for the second expansion of around 7 years. The final couple of years is the most intense, speculative, over the top part of the cycle, leads to a peak, and then it all comes crashing down. There's a major recession, takes much longer for it to get sorted out, but eventually it does, and it sort of resets and it starts all over again. I mean, I sort of got the concept of that from something that this English economist Fred Harrison wrote, who probably was one of the most important people to identify the 18-year cycle, or at least rediscover it. I think is probably more accurate to say, because actually
Mm-hmm.
it was discovered by an American economist in the 1930s. But I sort of put a couple of additional pointers on there. And then what I've done with this diagram, which I've now updated over the years and also included in my book in some way, is just to put a yellow dot on where we are in the cycle. And I've also illustrate in the book the sorts of things you can expect at each of those stages in the cycle. So, in the best time to buy is the worst time in terms of news and access to bank credit and so on. So you've got to do a lot of cash buying, got to be quite quick. You've got to be quite bold because everyone else is telling you this is really the time to buy. You get to the winner's curse phase, it's emotionally much easier to buy, much more credit available. All your friends are talking about how much money they're making with their investments, and it might not be property, it might be some stock market portfolio, it might be some crypto portfolio, it might be something else entirely. Fine wine, not so fine wine, who knows? It's sort of, that's much easier to make those decisions, but it's probably the worst time because, as you can see, you're not far from the major crisis.
One of my questions is that I just really struggle to wrap my head around is I was looking at the numbers, 2000, and I was looking at an area 2020 to 2000 until right now. This area did 80%, and in like 80% of value. Like it's gone absolutely mental, and we are here in the cycle. We're on this little line, so we're yet to see some real true growth. But we've had such an incredible run in property in Australia. Like, how can it continue? Like, how is it possible that this thing can, in 3 years,
when you start to get into a winner's curse, though, Joe, you think it can't lose.
I mean, I think you'll probably see it more obviously in the stock market, because the stock market is much more liquid and people are buying, selling all the time. Property, it takes ages to kind of buy, and so it's not quite the same thing. I think. Back to my point, it doesn't mean that everywhere is going to go up to the same extent. I mean, you tend to find that the bigger cities in Australia towards the end of the cycle don't do all that much, because all of the sort of speculative action is, again, the proverbial town at the edge of Darwin type thing, right? So someone comes up with a story that, this is the great place. It's, weather, there's no rain at all. It's a great tourist destination. Chinese buyers and Chinese tourists are looking to come there for their, summer vacations or whatever. I mean, I'm obviously just making things up, but, you can see the story, and then people think this is the place to be investing in. It might not be a very large number of people, but it's much more than that sort of little location can handle, and it drives prices up far more than they can go, and so on. And that's kind of the real danger sign of the cycle. It's not actually that prices in central locations have gone up significantly, because there's always going to be demand for living in the best locations. I mean, again, it's land is in the best locations is ultimately very scarce. So you kind of have to, in a sense, be quite smart about how you view what things are. It's not simply you just take a price chart and you say, well, it doesn't look like it's kind of doing what I think it should be doing, so therefore it's the cycle is off, and so on. I think that's a kind of a general point I'd make, but nonetheless, I do believe, to your other question about we haven't really seen the worst of it, I do think the next 2 to 3 years are going to be really sort of crazy in terms of behavior. I just feel that. I should say, and I did talk about another cycle in the book, the commodity cycle,
100-year commodity cycle,
50, 60. I put that in there, not, I mean, it's an important cycle, but I didn't want to distract from the 18-year story. It's just that it's going to drive a lot of the political turbulence we've seen over the last few years, and it's going to make the news, quite difficult. And so, people may not really be focusing so much on kind of investing in the same way as you would otherwise, because because the news is going to be really difficult, and there's some really horrible things going on around the world, and I don't think that's going to ease up anytime either. So I wanted people to be aware of that sort of narrative, because that might mask some of what's going on.
I wanted to know, because in the advent of a technology, like a hyper sort of technological age, where I don't know if Moore's law can keep going, because how can we just keep getting better and better technology? What does that sort of do to an 18.6 year kind of economic cycle? Does that cycle sort of halve or shorten because things are sort of quicker around, or it still sort of carries on, you think?
Well, I mean, this cycle isn't the first cycle where there's been major technology introduced, and so far historically we haven't seen technology shortening the cycle, and I don't think it will this time either. So now so the book is kind of structured around a full cycle, and I divide it to stages, and I use different episodes to illustrate the stage, and I chose the one related to where we are now quite deliberately, and I went back to the UK in the 1840s. Now you think, why the hell would you do that? What relevance does that have?
Industrial Revolution, isn't it?
Well, no, it was the introduction of the railways. So it was just after the Industrial Revolution, the introduction of the railways, and there was enormous hype around that. But the railways in their time were probably among the most revolutionary technology in human history. I mean, you know, the shortest time you could get across the United States, for example, and before the railways was sort of 3 weeks, and that's, I mean, literally just traveling. Right. Wow. After the railways were introduced, it would be 3 days. I mean, that sort of conquest of space and time, you know, I don't think we'll ever really see in to quite the same degree. And it changed everything. You didn't need, you know, standardized clocks, for example, until you had railways, because you didn't need timetables and so on. You didn't, you know, need to know when to come to the station. You didn't have tourism. You know, it drove a lot of changes to the workspace where the economy was, people were located, and all the practices that we have that are part of our modern life. Now, the first part of that in the late 1840s was pure speculation. I kind of made that, I didn't really explicitly make this point, but the point here is that actually AI is going to revolutionize everything, I think. But at the moment is a lot of hype, in my view. It's, you know, people are experimenting and so on, and that new business models are evolving, and it is going to, in time, really change everything. But at the moment, it's just kind of, you know, I think it's still early days. And I wanted to make the point, if the railways didn't change the timing of the cycle, equivalent to the creation of fire. That's funny. Yeah, so if it didn't change the timing of the cycle in 1840s, I don't feel it's going to change the timing of the cycle now. Wow.
Okay. It's that's how confident you are on it.
Yeah. Well, see, I mean, you know, I could, you know, I mean, see, the thing about studying history is, and identifying these patterns, and you understand why the dynamic works. It's not that it can't change. Of course it can, but you have to see a real fundamental reason to then change your forecast, because it's, you know, in my view, based upon, you know, the fundamental laws of economics and how investors come together. It's not the latest thing. I mean, people made similar claims about the internet in the 90s. So, you know, I'm not saying these aren't very big game changing things, but, you know, we see from history that it plays out in this kind of way, and it takes a lot to change that. And maybe AI is that thing. It's going to change everything straight away. But I made the point about the railways. I think we have sort of recency bias in our view about things. We think this era is somehow different, or this technology is somehow different. And we forget how revolutionary other things have been in the past.